Welcome to the Adventures in Awareness podcast, where in partnership with the Psychedelic Society, we're conducting a series of discussions on psychedelics, meditation, and enlightenment. I'm very happy to have with us here today cultural changemaker, cooperative technologist, and founder of the Psychedelic Society, Stephen Reid. Stephen completed a master's in complexity science at the University of Bristol, as well as a master's in physics, specialising in quantum field theory at the University of Oxford. As if that wasn't enough, he was also the youngest ever board member of Greenpeace UK and selected as the Green Party parliamentary candidate for Totnes. As well as quantum field theory and complexity science, Stephen has training in software development, meditation, plant medicine, and political activism. So welcome, Stephen.
Hello.
I feel you bring quite a unique perspective by combining experience in quantum physics, meditation, and psychedelic explorations. So I'm thinking it could be a great way to start to give people a sense of your story and how you ended up combining all three and having an interest in mystical experiences.
Yes, I guess I'd actually had at least a couple of what I now consider to be mystical type experiences even before I came to psychedelics. So I didn't really understand them in those terms at that time. And when I was studying for my final year exams, degree in physics at Oxford, just as I was like revising the quantum field theory stuff and like just sort of really cramming myself with it, I had this strange sense of that I had kind of like reached the bottom of the stack. Because for context, like each year in a physics degree, you're taught a theory, but you're told this isn't the final theory because like you're going to learn a more complicated and kind of more deeper one next year, and so on and so on and so on. But by the time I reached this final year, although I wasn't studying like the full standard model, I was just beginning my studies in quantum field theory, really. I was at least studying like, kind of more, the outline, the basics of what physicists consider to be like the fundamental, at least one of the two most fundamental theories in physics right now, along with general relativity, which is a quite different formalism. I had this feeling of, despite the fact I had kind of reached the ground in some sense, this feeling of groundlessness with a sense of, is this it? Is this what everyone goes on about? Because right. I had reached this apparently most fundamental level, yet I could see that I was still experiencing symbols in awareness, symbols in consciousness, if you like. And it was a kind of, it was like a more complicated and potentially more interesting and more useful in some sense set of symbols than the symbols that I've been studying the years previous. Mm-hmm. But this thing was still happening in my own consciousness and to some extent is, you could say it's a shared construct of consciousness between the other humans that had collectively co-created this thing. But it was initially quite intense, and then I went round feeling a little bit like I was kind of dreaming or in a strange, like I was kind of somehow floating for the next couple of weeks with this sense of of lightness in my body.
Wow.
And with feeling like I got this, kind of like I got the joke. The cosmic joke is like, physics is apparently this like very serious thing, but actually when you come down to it, it's just ultimately it's just a kind of set of shared agreements by other right. Conscious beings, but that process is ultimately kind of happening in consciousness. And I guess, although I hadn't really studied non-duality in consciousness at that point, I had that kind of feeling of, oh, okay, wow, like it's consciousness that's perhaps more fundamental than any of this, because that's what physics is happening in.
And I remember you saying something along the lines of, like, it almost felt like the ground, like you're saying, the ground falling away, of you're reaching the edge of human knowledge. Like there isn't another more sophisticated theory coming up the year after, and it still doesn't explain everything. Did that have something to do with it?
Exactly. And subsequently, I became very fond of the work of David Bohm, who writes very eloquently on just, there is an assumption by many physicists, or at least many junior physicists, let's say, that physics is finite, that it is in principle possible to find something like a final theory or what they call grand unified theory and so on. And he says, on what basis do we assume that this is the case? Is it not, can we not equally, entertain the possibility that physics itself is infinite, that there will be no like final theory, no endpoint to it? So it was feeling like, oh, well, this is not the end, and like how ridiculous for me to realize that like there could ever be an end, given that this is occurring in mind. Yeah.
And just to contextualize this experience a little bit further, Was this partly a product, because I imagine there's many different motivations for studying physics to a very high level. So was part of it for you this hunger for the ultimate truth, which is in a way a spiritual endeavor in itself?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was a big motivation for studying physics, and then for going like into the kind of deep theoretical side of things rather than staying involved in a more kind of like practical and experimental side. Yeah, I guess it was funny, and it was humbling. You know, I don't have the final answer. I don't think there is a final answer, and just start, and maybe that was the beginning of me just getting used to that idea. You know, it was a switch from feeling like I want that answer, that final answer, to be stuck being okay, there isn't one, and like how am I going to change how I live my life and my desires in life, like given that shift in perspective.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge. I'm just curious now, is this a common paradigm shift that happens in those circles where, you know, people finally reach that level of theoretical physics and suddenly it was like you could speak to your tutor and like, oh yes, I understand this is part of the path, as it were, of studying physics to this level? Or was it somewhat of did you have people you could speak to? Did your classmates resonate with what you were saying, or was it just something you couldn't really mention given the culture of that environment?
I think there's a real diversity of opinions and perspectives on this within physics. And it overlaps with one's broader spiritual beliefs and perspectives. I wouldn't say it's by no means, it's not like necessary to kind of have the experience, like have to be a good physicist. That much is true. Like, because what distinguishes physical science from spirituality, if you like, and is that science has this element, at least, of being intersubjectively verifiable, that you can conduct experiments and like you can still, whether or not you kind of have these mystical spiritual type experiences in relation to physics. And I'm not the only physicist or scientist that has experienced something like this, but it doesn't seem like everyone does. And lots of it, you know, those people are all often very good scientists in the sense of like they're still producing good theory that matches with our experiments. So it's a quite mysterious phenomenon, I guess.
But is it alienating, or is there room for it in that culture? Because it's such an, I know nothing about that culture. Could you go and talk to your friends at the time around that, or your tutors, or
I mean, and it was I mean, particularly since the advent of even kind of the earliest quantum theory in sort of the beginning of the 20th century, physicists kind of started getting used to the idea that they had to also be philosophers in some sense. And of course, and actually, I mean, that's like not looking back far enough. You could say like, anyone working on whatever at the time is considered to be like fundamental physics, even which at some point was Newton, even though we consider Newtonian physics to be like pretty basic stuff nowadays. Like Newton was thinking about God and like what does this say about God and, you know, the universe and so on. And nowadays we wouldn't think that Newtonian physics has very much to say about God at all. But he did back then, and nowadays, like the equivalent is, you know, what does quantum physics have to say about consciousness? And maybe in 100 years from now, we'll say like, what a ridiculous idea that quantum physics had anything to do with consciousness, because both of those fields develop, and then in time we see that maybe they're not as fundamental as we once thought they were.
And then they kind of act out as the most useful metaphors for our understanding of consciousness or God or whatever.
I mean, but I guess the reason why that we relate them at any point in time is because like they're things at the limit. Like consciousness is kind of by definition that which is always at the limit of our understanding in some sense, I would say. And then at any point in time there exists a scientific theory or physical theories that are also at the limit, and so like we join these things together because they're, you know, we think they're both at the limit, so they must have some relationship, but that may or may not be true as those limits change.
So just chart for me the path then from this experience or this kind of shift in your paradigm, so physics maybe no longer holds the promise of providing an end answer, an end point, and maybe there isn't even an end point. The path from that into psychedelics and meditation, did one come before the other? Were they initially linked in any way?
As a kind of bridge, if you like, were my studies in complexity sciences, which is still science, but like really emphasizing self-organization and emergence, and lots of studies of biological phenomena and, you know, living systems. a cell or a human being has a quite different quality to it than like billiard balls, like kind of knocking around sort of in predictable ways on a table. And that, along with my readings of particularly of David Bohm, who I mentioned already, like were my kind of bridge from this quite kind of mechanical and structured and ordered notions of physics and of, by extension, kind of the world, or at least my desire for those things, to something a kind of more messy and more complex, shifting from complicated to complex, and maybe initially finding that quite uncomfortable, but becoming more comfortable with it over time as I kind of read more and perspective adjusted a bit. And I had my first psychedelic experience in 2012. It was it was a kind of mystical, spiritual type experience. I had this real sense of cosmic connectedness that I suppose I wondered for some time, what is the point of the universe being so big, or is there a point to the universe being so big? And that first trip, I had this sense that, you know, I in some sense I was those stars and I was those faraway planets, and through mind I could even like journey to them or get some taste of them, of what it might be like to be that star or that planet, or it's quite difficult to articulate clearly, but that inspired a fascination with these substances for the kind of the strange and wonderful shifts in perspective they can bring about. And I found my previous studies in physics, and particularly readings of Bohm, incredibly useful in kind of scaffolding my experience. Bohm's like emphasis on the unity and interconnectedness of all things, and what he calls the implicate order, that there is like a kind of a hidden unifying order behind the apparent separateness of phenomena that we experience in everyday reality. And I feel really grateful that I came to psychedelics a little bit later in life in that sense, and had something to build those experiences on, or to have to put them in context in some way.
It's super interesting because I am speaking to some people who do regret starting them so young, maybe 14, 15, and spinning out, and it being perhaps a little very entertaining and mind-opening, but at the same time causing a little bit of suffering. And Roland in his research talks about the usefulness of having some kind of context. So it's interesting that the context that you were given came from the physics world rather than necessarily what I think a lot of people assume to be the useful context in these circles, which would be more, you know, the spiritual Taoist Buddhist teachings.
Well, indeed, and that's the next step really, because but then it didn't take me long to kind of move more into that world.
Yeah. And were you initially taking psychedelics as like a curiosity, like someone might try their first drink of alcohol or something, or was it because you'd heard, all right, maybe there isn't the final answer in physics, but I'm still curious, does it exist, or how am I now living without even that search anymore?
No, I didn't. More just a curiosity about psychoactive substances in general, and just becoming, wow, like I'd only just realized like that it was possible to kind of alter my consciousness in so many kind of different and quite interesting ways in the sort of year to 18 months previous to that first psychedelic experience. So like psychedelics were just like, okay, like let's see how this class of substance alters my neurochemistry and, you know, like perceptual apparatus. And it's and the way that it did was much more profound than any other psychoactive shift that I had experienced previous.
I remember hearing quite recently that it's fairly common for many Buddhist monks, contrary to what probably most people believe, to not have a meditation practice, that it's still, even in Buddhist circles, a relatively esoteric thing to have a daily meditation practice, to sit there in silence. And so that's something that you're doing now, as I understand. You've got a relatively serious practice. And if I remember right, you've also been on these retreats where you do like 10 days, silent retreats with many hours each day. Is there a link between the psychedelics and the meditation, as you mentioned? Or
after my first psychedelic experiences, I kind of went back to the writings of David Bohm, and then became interested in the fact that he had a dialogue with Krishnamurti, who's a sort of Indian spiritual teacher, let's say, who was teaching mostly, I think, in the 70s and 80s. That was really interesting. That was like, oh wow, like, well, this quite serious physicist, who incidentally was seen like as a bit out there by other physicists, but won some really important prizes in physics, was also very, very respected. It's like, well, if this serious physicist is talking to this spiritual teacher, like, maybe there's something in this whole spirituality thing. And so having always just written off religion and spirituality as a kind of like slightly sort of childish and facile thing, and a bit of like a crux for people, kind of psychological crux of people that maybe haven't quite grown up properly. Okay. I'm really. Let's check this out again. Let's revisit this, conjuring or the thought, which I guess have been present with me all the time to some extent. Like, well, maybe there's a reason why these things have persisted for thousands of years. These stories, above all stories, have persisted for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Beyond them simply being kind of like comforting. And I became, at some point, I think I was actually in a bookshop in Mendocino in California on the west coast of the United States. I picked up a copy of the Tao Te Ching and just blew my mind. Yeah. Wow. It just resonated so strongly. Both with certainly my studies in complexity science, sort of, but also my psychedelic experiences of just emphasizing unity and interconnectedness and flow and the unity of opposites. It was in such a beautiful and poetic way. And so that's really, if there's one tradition that I kind of really sort of resonate with still above others, it is Taoism. So the meditation came in even after that. Actually, it was like in the context of becoming of reading more about Taoism and also Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism. There's a great book called Zigzag Zen Buddhism and Psychedelics, which had a big impact on me. Then I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll give this meditation thing a go. People seem to be pretty into it. And one of my earliest experiences was to go on a Vipassana. I really threw myself in at the
deep end, dove right in.
Which I really do not recommend. I mean, I had the best of intentions. I had the intention that I would, having booked the Vipassana like 6 months out, I would use those 6 months to develop that regular practice. It didn't happen. Right. I ended up going into it with like really, very regular daily practice still, and it was incredibly challenging. Mainly on my body actually and subsequently I realized that, read and understood, this is how yoga and meditation are related, right. Like in a big way, like the yoga, and in a big way for many yogis, like yoga was just like the necessary work you had to do so that you could sit in meditation for hours at a time. So I understand that a bit better now, and like that's one more motivation for sort of keeping yoga and being in my body. But anyways, subsequent to that, at least after maybe after a month of kind of just feeling mildly traumatized, and like I did actually start developing that regular meditation practice, and now I pretty consistently meditate for between half an hour and 45 minutes each day in the morning.
I feel like it's useful just to draw out a couple of things that you've said that I think are fair warnings. One is, you mentioned being grateful that you came to psychedelics later in life. So I was thinking, that might be useful to just come back to that. Is there any particular reason? Is it something that, I know you've been a big advocate for psychedelics, but would you necessarily, if you had a 14-year-old or 15-year-old niece or nephew or son or daughter interested, what's the right age from your perspective to? The
right age is different. It's more about development, right? And you can, than age, I would say. To the extent that that's a cop-out, and you can say, well, let's take kind of the development of the average human being, whatever that means, in the West or in the UK, then I would have thought waiting till age 18 is totally reasonable.
In what respect had you developed? You're grateful that you took it then rather than 5 years or 3 years before?
Some kind of other important and ways of understanding reality. More than that, it's the ability to inquire, because psychedelics, with this notion of them being non-specific amplifiers, they can
just draw out that term for us for a second.
So this was used by Stan Grof, that said that one of the key features of psychedelics is that they're not kind of inherently good or inherently bad, or that they will amplify, they will intensify the context in which they're taken.
Yeah.
And this can often be like a very useful property. How if you're not aware of this property, and furthermore, if you don't have the ability to, if you haven't developed the tools of inquiry and deconstruction and questioning to a sufficient degree, they can like send people off feeling like very sure of themselves, or very sure that like this is how the universe is, or this is how I should live my life, without having that ability to question, say, well, to what extent is this simply a product of my psychedelic experience, and how and what other ways could I see this? And so actually more than simply the kind of knowledge of physics and physical theories that I developed, it was actually more the ways in which I'd learned to inquire, I'd learned to ask questions, and I'd learned to be skeptical to some sense. And the confidence to question is very useful in the context of psychedelics. This gets said to people very often when, in the context of sort of organized psychedelic ceremonies and retreats, you might come up with a seemingly great idea that you should, quit your job and like go and live around the other side of the world, or ditch your boyfriend, or whatever it might be. It's like, and you always get told, it might be a great idea, but give it a week. Just pause slightly and make sure you are seeing that idea in the context of all this. So that's the kind of point you want someone to have reached, the ability to slow down and to just question before like rushing into any particular decision, or becoming overly convinced of any aspect of the reality of their trip. It might be a great idea, and their insights might be totally spot on, but it's just like, and that's why meditation comes in as well, because it maybe encourages that slowness and that questioning in a way.
The ability to question the kind of sense of conviction or certainty, which is another thing that can come and go. To see how any sense of certainty or decision integrates with other aspects that might not be under consideration at that moment. Okay, that's really useful. And maybe I'll just add with the Vipassana story. I also dove straight into the Vipassana thing, felt mildly or even a bit more traumatized. I think it was counterproductive and also exacerbated. I was encouraged to sit still in a certain posture, and I think I exacerbated an injury that really still hasn't gone away several years later. So I know many people have benefited a lot from diving straight in, but also I think it's worthwhile knowing that can happen, and just to have a bit of caution coming into any of these powerful practices, whether it's meditation or psychedelics. So circling back around, you're now meditating, you're still engaged in various psychedelic experiences. How do you feel those relate for you now? And do they feel like separate paths or separate endeavors, or do you sometimes combine them? Have you discovered anything that you feel like it's worth sharing or noticing?
Yeah, I don't follow one particular meditation teacher or path as a devotee. Let's say like I jump around quite a lot on a time frame of like a few months. Like I'll stick to one practice for a few months and be like, okay, I've got what I want from that for the time being, and then try something else. So the one I'm currently engaging, I'm actually going back to the beginning myself right now and meditating chapter by chapter on the Tao Te Ching. I'm uncovering like a deeper layer of understanding and insight through just doing it in that slow way. I mean, it's short enough, as you may know, you can read it in a day, but what you get from reading it in a day is quite different to reading it in 81 days. And previous to that, I followed the meditations in the book Seeing the Freeze by Robert Baer, which I think you at least have, and maybe if you've read or read some of them now.
I've read large chunks of it, and also highly recommend. It's great.
Some of the practices I've probably kind of come back to most consistently is the work of Reggie Ray and his like somatic meditations, and really being with the body and just saying what is actually happening in the body right now, and quite different to the emptiness meditations actually, which are kind of I think explicitly analytical at times, and say like it's fun, which that was interesting for me, because like a lot of mindfulness meditation at least is about just like clearing the mind, and like just if a thought comes, let it go, whereas like some of Rob's work is saying there's a place for analysis in meditation, and like you can activate your brain, and you can, at least if you're activating it in the right way and kind of using it in that kind of focused sense, you may well reach some important kind of meditative realizations. And I mean, he also says that's not the only way of like getting to that point, and there is a way of having a kind of a more clear and direct way of getting to those places. But I found that very interesting, because to someone that clearly, I mean, he's actually recently passed away, as you may know. So someone who was really greatly respected in the kind of meditation community, taught Gaia House for many years, to just say this is an analysis and the thinking mind actually can have a role in meditation. I found one of the most striking aspects of that book. So, and how does this all interact with my psychedelic experiences? Psychedelic trips can feel to me, and I think to others, like, that's why that word is used, trip, but maybe like I'm on a boat, let's say, and sometimes the water's calm and other times it's really fucking stormy and there's like you're getting water in your face and you just need to really like hold on to something. And it's probably in those periods that the meditative practice comes in most useful, of when the psychedelic trip is becoming very turbulent. They offer me some ways of staying focused and staying grounded, whether that's through meditations on the impermanence of phenomena, of the emptiness of all things, whether it's particular verses from the Tao Te Ching, or whether it's, say, meditating on and with the body and just saying, okay, what's actually happening right now? Okay, I'm with my breath and I'm with my heartbeat and I'm with the sensations in various parts of my body. Like, so yeah, it could be, it could be any and all of those that I might come back to in those more intense moments of a psychedelic trip. And whether you have turbulent parts of a psychedelic trip or even just an entirely turbulent psychedelic trip is, to some extent, you might even say to a great extent, like outside of your control. You can pay attention to your mindset and setting, like physical setting coming into the trip. But even if you do that, it's quite possible that, for whatever reason, it's like you have a really challenging time. And that's why it makes a lot of sense for anyone to develop some experience with these meditative practices before they go into have these psychedelic experiences.
And do you take psychedelics now? And obviously, someone might take psychedelics one day for one reason. One day I'm eating for nutrition, another day I'm eating for pleasure, and just normal food. I mean, but as a component of any psychedelic experience you have a kind of, and spiritual might not be the best word, but any kind of ambition or curiosity or interest in the direction of having insights or realizations that are talked about in these various traditions.
I'm very fond of this quote from Senju Suzuki Roshi that's in the book Zigzag Zen Buddhism and Psychedelics. He said, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as an enlightened person. There is only enlightened action. And that's always resonated with me. And at the very least is the kind of, in Buddhism, we might think of it as, on one hand, you have the three marks of existence, anicca, dukkha, anatta, and there's like various meditative practice you can use to kind of get a kind of deep insight into those three phenomena, or indeed the kind of emptiness of all of them, you might say. But on the other side, you have the Brahmaviharas. You have four like sublime abodes, qualities of love, which are metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha, the loving kindness, compassion, empathic joy, and equanimity, which are, and they're really quite different things, but or at least it seems like that. On one hand, you have these like quite kind of like cosmic deep realizations about the world, and on the other hand, you have like like love people and so
just be nice,
be nice, and like celebrate when something good happens to them and so on. And I'd say they both seem very important to me, and we might say I think it's possible to reach awakening or enlightenment through one or the other, or both. But I would say I would really question, or I'd be very curious to hear someone kind of claiming a level of an enlightenment or awakening purely on the basis of one of those two things. I'm not saying who knows. I'm not saying it's not possible or not valid entirely, but I would be, if someone's only behaving in very like loving, compassionate ways, but like doesn't really seem to have like really questioned or really got anything of the kind of like these deeper characteristics of reality, and was saying and saying they've reached enlightenment, I'd be like, okay, but but what about that deep level of inquiry? And the more common one, I think, at least in like Buddhist communities, as far as I can tell, or pseudo-Buddhist communities, is people having kind of deeply inquired into those core aspects of reality, of impermanence and of not self and so on, and claiming a level of enlightenment but actually they're not very nice people. and I don't, you know, and I don't feel, maybe others don't feel the loving kindness and the compassion coming from them.
Yeah.
And happily there seems to be a strong relationship between these two things for most people most of the time. And as we deepen our interest in our practice in one, then the kind of our insight in the other kind of grows in a relatively natural way. And that's the kind of the magic, in a way, of practice. Yeah.
In your own path, do you feel like psychedelics are more useful for one or meditation for the other? Are they both equally useful for both?
No, I don't think like one is more useful for one or the other. I think they can both be useful for both, and I think it really, I'd say that, you know, they're tools. It's like it really depends on the context and like the intention of their use. Like we can use it. There's a big, you know, the kind of trend right now in psychedelics, at least, is kind of psychedelic psychotherapy and using psychedelics more on that side of developing, first releasing trauma and then developing that love and compassion and so on. The emphasis on psychedelic retreats is not just generally not so much on the kind of the insight side of things. I think that that was the original focus of the Psychedelic Society psychedelic experience retreats. I think we might even still say like they're designed for people interested in exploring the nature of reality in the mind. We never said these are retreats for people that kind of have a, you know, suffering suffering and want to come to terms with and move beyond and integrate past trauma. But it moved in that direction because that's what everyone was hearing about, and that's the kind of people that were applying to come on the retreats. And so and that's indeed why they kind of actually separate to become a new organization in some ways, so that we can really make that focus clear, I guess. I think psychedelics can absolutely be used to obtain deep insight into the fundamental characteristics of reality. They're not just kind of therapeutic tools. And then of course you can, you know, again, often those things are linked. And similarly with meditation, like you can kind of explicitly be meditating on loving kindness and compassion and so on, or you might choose to never do that and purely be focusing on insight and non-dual practices. And that it's the choice of each individual. How are you spending your time? But it seems important for people to, and I guess this is why I've been happy to do this conversation, because I anticipated we would get to something like this. It feels like an important perspective to get out there. Well, the agency of that we each have in deciding what these practices and what these tools are for, and what ways we want them to develop us or help us develop. I think it's healthy to maintain a constant curiosity in what ways do I feel like I've got somewhere and I have developed, and in what ways do I have some work to do? And then we might find that, okay, maybe it's time that I put down my emptiness meditation practice for some time and pick up, maybe start doing one that's a bit more focused on the kind of loving kindness side of things. Or similarly with psychedelics, maybe it's time that I stop having super high dose, cosmic far out experiences of the unity of all things and focus on slightly more manageable doses with maybe longer lasting substances where I actually have the chance to kind of go back into more personal material and develop in that way. And actually in psychedelics, one of the choices there is actually what psychedelic substance to use. Like you have things like DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, which are extremely short acting, and people often take high doses such that they are instantly experiencing totally otherworldly phenomena. In case of 5-MeO-DMT, very often having this kind of instant and profound experience of unity and a kind of original kind of pure white light of the ground of being. And that's very, very different to a 12-hour LSD trip sitting on a therapist's couch, where you might at times be experiencing that kind of unity of all things, but very probably you will also encounter more personal material. And I think they can both be useful. It's not to say what one is the right way of doing things, and psychedelics should only be used for these super direct cosmic experiences. And it really depends where we are and what we want.
I'm aware as well how meditation has come to the West, and its original context is a kind of spiritual path and a way of unifying oneself with God or cosmic consciousness, or seeing deep into the nature of reality, or eliminating all kinds of suffering to the point that rebirth no longer happens, and all these really cosmic claims. And for the most part now in the West is being used or coming into the mainstream as a way of enhancing performance or reducing stress, and maybe becoming part, I think even in the NHS, as therapeutic tools for people who are suffering psychologically. And similarly, what I see with psychedelics is, the mystical experience is seen as valuable to the extent that it helps someone overcome trauma or addiction, and not for its own sake. And of course, these are wonderful things, but at the same time, I'd love to create more spaces where also for people who aren't necessarily suffering. Of course, I want people to be suffering less, but also even if someone isn't going through great suffering in this moment, that there is something to be discovered here and something to investigate. And I asked you, do you believe that ongoing shifts in perception are possible for people? And you said through psychedelics and meditation that is possible. And I'm aware it can sound a little bit like boasting in some cases to say, I now experience life this way or whatever. But at the same time, I think it's really valuable just for people to hear really specific examples of the kind of different ways life can move from one way of being experienced to another, or perception of life can move from one.
Several times, and still, one of the more profound and fun and interesting effects that I experienced during psychedelic trips is a sense of all things being in flow. I mean, this is a relatively common experience where it can seem like kind of everything is a fluid. It's like we're used to seeing, rocks or something like very hard and static, and then kind of like, gazing at rivers or streams and seeing them really move. But in the psychedelic experience, for me, many times, it's like I can see that sense of flow in all things, including myself, actually. Like seeing my face age like before my eyes is an interesting effect of like gazing into the mirror sometimes during these experiences. That experience of seeing all things in flow during the trip, that's something that seems to last weeks, months, maybe lifetimes after the experience. Obviously not such an acute way of not really necessarily seeing something so acutely visual, but there's that feeling remains. I had those kind of experiences like before being very familiar with the term anicca and ideas of impermanence in Buddhism, and before realizing the real emphasis on flow in Taoism. And that's why those two bodies of thought or wisdom kind of resonated with me so strongly. And then it translates into everyday life, right? And it's a phrase in common use, just go with the flow, man.
Yeah,
I think it's possible that kind of was even popularized during kind of like first psychedelic sort of revolution in the 60s and 70s. Through what I've just spoken about, you see why maybe if there was a lot of LSD use and lots more people were kind of really seeing the fluidity of reality, that helps me to just encourages me to hold things a little bit more lightly, in the same way that I don't think I can like catch water. Yeah. or like pick up a stream. Yeah. It's like it encourages me not to hold on to anything too tightly. It becomes just like meaningless or an impossible task in the same way in some ways, and allows me to kind of just live with a sense of lightness and smile perhaps when I catch myself like trying to hold on to things that on some deeper level now I know like cannot be held onto.
I really like that because it does chime with a lot of spiritual teachings you hear, which is the cause of so much suffering is ignorance. And a lot of teachings talk about letting go and the virtue of letting go. But the teachings around, well, if you just see the ignorance, you'll let go automatically. Once someone understands, I was trying to grasp water, you don't have to tell them to let go. You are letting go whether you like it or not. The water's not going to stay very long in your hands. It's not that you let go, you give up the effort to not let go.
Exactly.
And I'm tempted to project that the teachings of impermanence or flow were easier for you to incorporate because of your scientific training. And just correct me if I'm wrong, including this idea of emergence and complexity, but also you've spent more time thinking about these things around us that look solid. Mm-hmm. Perhaps at least you've got like an intellectual understanding how really, if we look a bit closer, they're not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's actually a fantastic book by Fritjof Capra, The Tao of Physics, I think it's called, that had a big impact on me because it pointed out the similarities between modern quantum physics, quantum field theory, and the kind of Taoist worldview. In the kind of quantum field theory worldview, all phenomena is seen as vibration in fields that permeate all of time and space. And in this sense, nothing is ever static. To be is to become. It's a, reality is a constant becoming and a constant shifting, a constant changing, and that all things are in process. And David Bohm underlines this nicely by saying that the most real part of language is the present participle, and he invites us to play a game where we only speak in present participles. And Alan Watts does something quite similar in some of his lectures, but rather than saying like I am a human, we would say like there is humaning. There is a process of something becoming a human, and you might say like it's a constant becoming. In each moment, like that humaning is renewed until it's not, of course. And and when there's no more humaning, there's decaying. There's various points I kind of play with this seeing this way of seeing the world, of thinking about everything in terms of these present participles in this process. And so for sure, there's an intimate relationship between modern physics and these concepts of impermanence. Yeah.
And would you say in your case that you're able to, because I know for myself, I might learn some like very beautiful philosophies and they're very inspiring, but then when it comes to stubbing my toe or being annoyed with someone in my life or an aspect of work or something like this, sometimes they really do seem to help, but sometimes there's a gap between this understanding and then being able to apply that to what I do when I do continue to just grasp onto concepts or ideas or defending something that is inherently in flow.
I mean, yeah, for sure. Like let's say it like this. It's very rare that someone has one psychedelic experience or any other kind of experience that then like switches them to a permanent state of compassion and understanding towards everyone that they meet, and means that they no longer like shout at their dog when it poops on the sofa, or like get angry with someone when they kind of cut them up driving or whatever it might be. It's an ongoing process, as far as I understand, to refresh and renew these insights. It isn't like a switch that's like once it's switched on, it's like, okay, right, I'm done, I'm finished, I'm always like that forevermore. That isn't to say, however, that profound experiences cannot like produce like lasting results on the period of like weeks or months or maybe even years. I think it's a combination of doing the right practice and continuing to practice. Like what seems clear to me is that like if you're doing the wrong practice, no matter how much you're doing it, you might never achieve that that state of like compassion or calm or whatever it is that you're kind of aiming towards. On the kind of flip side of that, maybe just because you did work hard for a period of time and had some important experiences that did shift you to towards a more peaceful or kind state, doesn't necessarily mean like you're good and you're done now, and now you don't need to practice anymore. Most of the teachers that I've had the pleasure to like meet and work with, and I'm aware of, some people I don't know whether they would claim to have a degree of enlightenment, but people around them might claim to say they have a degree of enlightenment. They're still practicing. They're still sitting, or they're still using psychedelics in a careful way, or whatever it might be. The idea of practice is a really interesting one, and I certainly appreciate the kind of Zen take on it, of the most important and most fundamental sense. It's like there's nothing to get, and thus like there's nothing to practice to get, and kind of just see it's like right here on the face of it. At least it's such an antithesis towards kind of what is a current like quite popular like culture of personal development and doing the work. That's a key phrase in these times, where you just need to do the work, and like need to be in therapy for this many years, and you need to like sit in meditation for this many hours a day, and all this. And I think they're both true, and that clearly in some ways they seem opposite, and like when hitting upon paradox is often like I've learned that's generally quite a positive thing, and like a path to follow.
Yeah. In these spiritual circles or circles of meditators, this kind of thing, and these kind of phrases of be the change you want to see, I see some people, including myself to a certain degree, letting go a little bit of concerns around, say, activism. And I noticed that, so you talk about this perception of just noticing everything's in flow, everything's in change, you're kind of letting go. But you continue to be quite involved in various degrees of activism, whether Extinction Rebellion or other elements. So that seems to be a line for you. It doesn't seem to be in any conflict. And
those experiences of flow or impermanence encourage in me the quality or virtue, if you like, in Buddhist language, of equanimity. Yeah, this has been a bit of a journey for me to realize that equanimity, upekkha, is a subtle quality, that there's a big difference between cold indifference, because everything's constantly changing, and so what's the point of like doing anything? I'm just going to sit here and just like watch the show, and a kind of engaged neutrality or balanced engagement, which more and more what I saw and see is, I think, kind of what Buddhist teachers are getting at when they speak about this being a quality to be cultivated. And the wisdom of anicca is to enable us to bear the suffering of the world, but it doesn't mean we should just sit back and watch it. Like this, it's still an invitation to action, an invitation to compassion, to love in action. Yeah, I guess that's how it fits with me. It's like the wisdom of impermanence allows me to kind of just be with the suffering and of the world, and on the flip side, not to get too carried away in the kind of the high moments, knowing that those too won't last. The being with it is like a first step almost. It's like you first have to really be able to be with the fact, for example, of climate and ecological collapse, and not look away because it's too scary, which I think is a totally normal response. It's like you're telling me that like 1 billion people are going to be living in regions of the earth that are like just simply too hot for human habitation over the next 50 years. It's like the instinct to that is
can't
just
be true. Yeah.
I'm not going to think about that as just like, but to really like contemplate it, and in the context of the inevitable death of all of those people anyway, for example, is or has been a first step for me towards then thinking, okay, what can I do about it? Is there anything I can do about this? Because I desire to live a life free of suffering and to do what I can to relieve the suffering of others. And certainly the climate and ecological crisis is something that none of us are going to be able to escape from in this lifetime, and is calling us all to action.
I'm struck as well how, when you're talking about your journey, you talked about how initially going to Oxford and studying physics, it was driven to a certain extent by this thirst for truth, for like ultimate truth. And now I notice one thing you bring up a lot is, okay, well, how can we reduce suffering, and where's the compassion in this, and how are we treating each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I like to think it's both. And that furthermore, that they fit pretty well together, that the more clearly we can see reality and we get a sense of that truth. And I think it's like there's no end point. There's just like, but you go down layer by layer, or you're just constantly taking one more step on the path. Like that for me, and for many other people, comes with a growing compassion and interest in that which is outside oneself. It's that that's maybe one way of talking about it, is that the more we understand the temporary and illusory nature of self and the ego, the more natural it becomes to be interested in the well-being of not just myself, but the well-being of others, understanding that the two are not so different after all, and that separation is something which has been foisted on us in various ways and to varying degrees, starting with just probably the kind of the animal instinct for survival of these genes and this body, and kind of more modern way, you might say, like through neoliberal capitalism, of really promoting the idea of that you as an individual, as a consumer, that needs to like wear the right clothes and go to the right bars or clubs or theaters and whatever, and have as many Instagram followers as you can, and so on. And it's curious, like, so I'm just thinking that, of course, I have a personal website that I actually put a lot of work into, and quite a strong kind of self narrative, if you like. And I'm wondering, like, is to what extent is that inconsistent with, what I just said about kind of having a loosening of this sense of self, and or something that feels relevant and important is the way in which I've recently like stopped using Facebook myself. I have this sense of, in connection with like my personal website and the content that I put out, it's like I have more and more the sense of like I'm doing it for me, or like I'm doing it because it's something I love, and I'm not doing it. I don't have like a like button or a share like a share count on my personal site. It's like,
Right.
particularly since actually moving to Devon, I've kind of really stopped caring about that kind of thing. This part of the story is entering into deeper relationship with the land and the sea here. Came really at the same time of like losing this interest in social media. This is a bit of a tangent, I know, but this is
I think it's a great example. I mean, it's a big milestone for a lot of people to get off Facebook. But I mean, that, like, as ridiculous as that sounds, that's kind of a huge step for, I've kind of feel like something I've tried to get out of, and then something pulls me back in, and it might be work initially. And
yeah, and that, I think that, and just to try to relate it back to what we were talking about previously, it's, as I said, in this particular part of my journey, it's like it's entering into deeper relationship with the land here in Devon that helps me feel more, part of the cycle of life, and just being around more animals, like the wild ponies on Dartmoor, or the deer on the Dartington estate, and kind of rabbits running around, and pheasants flying across the road. It's just none of which was I was experiencing on a daily basis in London. Like, it has made social media just seem like a kind of slightly peculiar game. It's like I feel like I'm in touch with something more fundamental, and in that context, kind of like lost interest a little bit in exclusively human games. I actually would be very curious to like understand more, or like read more of the evidence of the relationship between some of these spiritual practices, meditation, or use of psychedelics, and social media use. I think it's not totally obvious to me what that would show at a kind of population level. But anyway, that's a future project.
well, so I mean, there's a long tradition of mystics going out into the upper mountains and into forests, and so that link seems anecdotal, at least, quite borne out. And I like your story about how you're still sharing, but you're sharing through your own website, and there's no longer I'm sure you could create it, but you're not tracking how many likes. I'm reminded how Glenn Gould noticed how his playing would subtly change. So he's kind of a very for anyone who doesn't know, he's a very famous concert pianist who a lot of people admire. But he noticed his playing would subtly change when there was an audience, and he didn't like that playing as much as the playing he did for his own. So he eventually, towards the end of his life, stopped doing public performances altogether and just did recordings, and would record them until they were what he believed they should be. And then they'd be released to the public, and they're beautiful and amazing. And I noticed practicing myself, this is how ludicrous the human brain can be. If I start to get quite good, if even the thought comes into my mind of like, oh, this is going to sound great when so-and-so hears it, the playing gets worse. Just like immediately. It's that strange circle of you're kind of just doing it for yourself, but potentially what it is purer, and you're sharing something more authentic.
And you're kind of in that context. So yeah, I'm curious about a couple of things come to mind actually. The pros and cons, or the differences in meditating alone, practicing alone and independently, versus being part of a sangha, like a kind of spiritual community that might have like a very strong kind of collective practice and set times that you're meditating. Thinking actually of that, when I say this, of Daniel Thorson, who's the host of the Emerge podcast, really excellent podcast that's been going on for probably 2 or 3 years now, and he's currently living in a place called the Monastic Academy. Also, kind of feels to me like therapy is becoming kind of normalized, kind of, there's a shift of becoming just a positive thing to be engaging in. Whereas, 5 or 10 years ago, it might have been, if you said you're having therapy, engaging in psychotherapy, people would have kind of been like, are you okay? It's not about like not being okay. No, it's just, so it's a well-being practice and not, not just for yourself, but for people around you. The flip side of that, this goes for both the meditation and the therapy, I guess. And I think possibly it comes under the term of spiritual materialism. To what extent do I engage in meditation or therapy to be able to simply say I'm engaging in meditation or therapy, and to obtain the kind of, as a way of seeking to obtain the kind of like respect of others, versus it simply being something which I fundamentally feel is, for my own good and well-being, and like something that I'm truly interested to kind of investigate or to grow from. Yeah, I can't say though that those spiritual materialist sort of aspects of my are totally absent for me. Like absolutely, there's a sense in which like I meditate because and I engage in therapy because I think other people will like it, and it will get me on a podcast, or I feel like I'm only at the beginning of an inquiry on that topic. I'm particularly curious about in the context of therapy, because of course therapy ain't cheap. Like at least with meditation, kind of like anyone with enough determination kind of be sitting and then sort of saying honestly, yeah, I meditate for an hour a day, whether that happens to be more for them, for themselves or for the people that they're speaking to. But with therapy, you actually need to have significant like financial means to kind of be engaging on that on a regular basis. And what does it mean, or what would it mean if that essentially becomes like a pass into certain communities? It's like you're not welcome in this community unless you're having therapy. But then some people simply can't afford to be engaging in that practice.
Yeah, it's beautiful to come into that already being aware of the shadow of it. I noticed in myself as well. There was a period where I was meditating and then telling people and feeling some pride around it, but then I stopped telling people, but then there was pride around that. So, I'm not sure I'm going to escape pride, but I think the inquiry is probably useful either way. Yeah. I'd love to circle background, because I'm aware that part of the motivation was to be able to speak with someone who has a psychedelic practice, let's say, and can speak with and is willing to speak about it openly and kind of extinguish some of the taboos around just like, yes, I take psychedelics and I find them useful in my life. And you're mentioning how but you're having direct experiences of the impermanence and the flow of things where objects no longer looked stable or solid. And I'm very curious, you were mentioning how that persists at some level.
What it's not is like an acute visual phenomena, which it often is in the psychedelic experience. To say it's lasting is something subtle and kind of in the background of my awareness, rather than something which is like as like an ongoing sensory phenomena for me.
You're not seeing the wall move around, but there's a knowing that is in fact what's behind the illusion of it being stable.
Yeah. I think that's closer to the mark. And curious how many, that quite a common way people describe their psychedelic trips is that it felt more real than everyday reality. There's a big difference between the term like psychedelic and hallucinogen. Like the hallucinogen like is really trying to suggest that any experience you have in the psychedelic state is a hallucination. Is then all the etymology of hallucination is, but like what we would understand from that nowadays is that it's a fabrication. It's taken you like away from reality, away from truth. And my experience and experience of many other people is that it's almost entirely the opposite, which is why it's so peculiar that like the term psychedelic and hallucinogen were, at least for a long time, used as interchangeably. That is much, much less the case nowadays. Nowadays we really seem to be settling on the term psychedelic, or even entheogen, which is another term that I really like.
We could rename them hallucinogen dampeners or something.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah. So I actually came up with a term which I tried to push at the beginning of the Psychedelic Society, but never really caught on, which is endosyndelic, which the Greek root of this would be revealing interconnection, revealing interconnectedness, which is, I guess, is distinct from what I was speaking about earlier with regards to kind of impermanence and flow, but feels also is another kind of classic psychedelic experience phrase. It's all one. This is something which I've heard many a time in trip sitting, and have heard come out of my own mouth in those peak moments. And a repeating sense for me on this is, or everyday reality being something like a painting on a canvas, and what I'm experiencing most of the time is the painting, and I'm appreciating all the qualities of that painting. There's a bright part there and there's a dark part there, and it's very colorful and very interesting. But with psychedelics, or high dose psychedelic experiences at least, just having this like, oh my god, like there's something deep in that. This is kind of reality is is like kind of on something, like there's a canvas, but like below which or beyond which sense perceptions are built on. And various people find various different like names for that canvas, or just that experience, that feeling. But it certainly chimes with the term Tao. Lao Tzu, he kind of even says it's like, I don't know what it is, and it's beyond words, but I'm just going to call it Tao for the sake of writing like a like a mystical book about it. Yeah, that fundamental sense of unity and interconnectedness, and that of course happens at different, not least depending on the dose of the psychedelic. One can have kind of really tune into that sense of unity and interconnectedness at different levels. It can be important to realize in a kind of ecological sense, particularly with outdoor psychedelic experiences. People know nowadays of like the ideas of like the wood wide web, and like there being like roots connected mycelial networks like under the forest floor. Perhaps even just like that notion of the leaves on the trees are like releasing the oxygen that I'm then taking into my lungs, and then I'm releasing out the carbon dioxide which they're taking in, you know, they're using for their metabolic processes. Like we learn this in sort of GCSE biology, but in psychedelic experiences can really like tune into that and be like, wow, like everything is so interdependent. Everything is like feeding and eating everything else in this perfect sense of balance. That sense of interconnectedness at the level of ecology is no more or less important than that like kind of more that deeper and more mystical sense of interconnectedness at the level of Tao. There you go. I've added one more along with that sense of like impermanence and flow there. To relate it back to Buddhist philosophy, again, I would call that it's like getting that embodied sense of anatta, that not self. Because I've been realizing that sense of unity and interconnectedness, whether at the kind of ecological, biological level or at the kind of more mystical level, the sense of self starts to loosen or dissolve even. You know, at the biological level, it's realizing that my body is a constant process of, you know, taking in oxygen and taking in food, and maybe tuning into the fact that, or like as many bacterial cells like in and on your body as you have human cells, that sense of oneself actually being a multitude, a community of so many different things. And then at the level of mystical or like interconnectedness and unity, it might actually be seeing one's own body kind of dissolve before them. This is where it gets almost impossible to describe in words, but really feeling like losing sense of the boundaries of one's own skin and merging into what might have previously seemed the kind of nothingness beyond, but maybe now one senses is that fundamental base of reality, which can be experienced I have experienced in different ways at different times, like sometimes being very rich and very full, and at other times being something like fundamentally like void and empty and with a certain like peace to it, which again it can sound kind of like paradoxical, but I'm still working on that, what the truth, that the kind of felt sense of the true nature of reality.
How do you now decide which substances, what doses? Is it based purely on instinct, or have you learned some things about, okay, I want to have a bit more compassion, or I want to remind myself of like the emptiness of all things, or what's guiding your practice and your explorations?
When I think about the classical psychedelics, like the biggest, one of the biggest divisions is between DMT and 5-MeO DMT, and which lasts 10, no more than 15 minutes, and like an extremely acute experience, versus all the longer lasting psychedelics, which can still be very, very strong experiences, but you can lose your sense of time in those. But to the extent to which you do retain a sense of time, or at least you kind of you rediscover it upon coming back around from the experience, there's a big difference there. 5-MeO DMT I think would be particularly interesting to meditators, as for me and for many other people it seems to offer, without quite knowing how to put it into words, like that like a taste of something like very pure and direct, and people often use terms like it was an experience of like pure void or pure light or pure emptiness, in contrast to DMT or NN-DMT, which almost always people say was extremely colorful weird, and like I felt like I was seeing architecture and you know, like other beings, and maybe having conversations with other beings, or they were like kind of dancing with me, or doing who knows what. People very rarely report any of that on 5-MeO DMT. And I actually I've met someone who actually would microdose 5-MeO DMT before meditating, and he said it would put him in just the most utterly concentrated and you know, often blissful states for hours at a time for longer than he could ever imagine meditating otherwise. I thought it was very interesting. And so I think there's huge potential to combine these practices, and I think it feels like we've only scratched the surface, certainly in the kind of academic research setting. Like, as you say, we're still very much focused on the therapeutic potential of these medicines, of these substances, which I totally get, but I'm not short of excitement for, you know, for the studies to start on the philosophical and kind of creative you know, questions around these substances and the combination of these practices. I think there is one study that's possibly still ongoing at Johns Hopkins University when they're giving psilocybin to rabbis and priests and other religious leaders, right, and asking them seeing how does psychedelic experiences like relate to your mystical teachings. Is that study been completed? Have you heard of that before? Or
I have heard of it. I'm not sure it's complete, but I've read reports on it.
Yeah, I know. I don't think it's complete, and I'm very much looking forward to kind of either sort of reading the results, or if it is already done, then like really catching up on that. It's my understanding, mostly in the context of Buddhism, that that Buddhist teachers do see some relationship between the psychedelic experience and like meditative experiences. It's not to say they're the same, or that there's at least the potential to combine them in a way which is useful, you know, beneficial, enlightening, if we dare use that word.
Yeah.
These are things that I would love the Psychedelic Society to, you know, to be able to do and to be doing. It sounds like maybe we're just kind of moving beyond this phase of where people have been very scared to talk about psychedelics and how they're using psychedelics. It might not even be that these substances need to be fully legal before we can actually just start doing kind of grassroots research projects on some of these questions, actually, as long as enough people are actually just simply comfortable to kind of admit to using them. And that certainly seems to be the case in the west coast of the United States, for example. It's not like, it's kind of weird if you haven't taken if you're not sitting in an ayahuasca circle and sort of taking LSD there, and I think in many circles. And I'm getting so much out of actually growing my own psilocybin mushrooms. It's it really feels like a God-given, a Tao-given right to do this. This feels like beyond the law, and you know, and I never. This is always for personal use. I occasionally will gift small quantities to friends and family, but I've never sold the mushrooms that I've grown, and it massively enhances the depth of the experience. And having built the relationship with the substance, the fungi, over a period of like 6 weeks, couple of months, and actually seen it pop up, seen it grow, promote the mystery of the experience. So this is truly like a living thing that I'm ingesting now. And it's quite different to the sense of just kind of taking a kind of pharmaceutically prepared pill, or that sense of that you're kind of like fusing your living being with the flesh, the fungal flesh of another.
I guess the kind of a magical mindset gives everything extraordinary significance, the color, the time of day, you know, what phase the moon is in, all this kind of thing. And even if someone doesn't really believe in any of that stuff, during the psychedelic trip, it kind of takes on a life of its own, whether you believe in it or not. And I imagine the kind of setting of having grown your own mushrooms has a large impact. And does it feel like you're communing, as it were, with an entity there, or does it just bring on the ecological connection, interconnectedness of all things, or does it bring forward the sense of like, okay, there's a spirit behind this plant here? And
I think it's very helpful to be able to switch between different frames, like in relationship to the psychedelic experience. I think there are times at which, and when I'm speaking of this, I mean like including at times in the trip itself, that it can be very helpful to think about it in a kind of neuroscientific way. And okay, well, what's going on is that my 5-HT2A receptor is being activated, and that's like turned down my default mode network, and that's allowing communication between like different parts of the brain, resulting in this aesthetic phenomena or whatever. And also it can be really useful to think about it in terms of plant spirit, or mushroom spirit, if you like. Mushrooms aren't plants. That you're actually kind of in relationship, having a conversation with some kind of intelligent other. To grow one's own mushrooms, is to understand that this is not that far out a thing to say. Like, of course, mushrooms are intelligent. Like all plant, all living things are intelligent and have a form of intelligence that they're capable of growing in a certain way to get what they need, whether that's light or water or a food source or so on and so on, and which is actually not so different to most human beings. We're just trying to grow in a certain way to get those same three things. Like, I know some people are a little bit like funny about the idea of like plant spirits, the idea of being kind of a conversation with an intelligent other, but growing one's own is a way, it has, for me at least, been a way of becoming just more comfortable with with seeing it like that.
Yeah, I know there's been long debates around even the intelligence of animals, and can they feel and do they think, but it's pretty clear that anyone who has a pet that they love, that certainly the behavior seems to indicate that they have a very clear sense of the animal's intelligence and love and relationship. And yeah, so I imagine something similar to growing your own plants. If you're forming that relationship where they're then going to drastically alter your consciousness.
Yeah, they it's funny, they can almost, like, I grow quite fond of my mushrooms. Like, they almost do feel like pets. But it's but I guess I also have this sense of that they're calling to be eaten. That's the kind of the end of their journey, in the way that your pet cat or your pet dog is definitely not calling to be eaten.
Yeah. With the experience you have now, and like I say, I know it's really hard in kind of to give very broad generalizations, but any words of caution or guidance that you might have given to yourself 4 years ago, or 5, if you go back and say to you, whoever you were 5 years ago, like, hey, maybe consider this or think about that?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, grow your own. A lot of my negative experiences have been in connection with having too easy access to too much or too high doses of a certain substance. That is just vastly reduced if you're growing your own. Like, firstly, you're likely only to be growing like small amounts, relatively small amounts at a time. And secondly, even if you do happen to like, end up with a lot at some point, you'll still, you've put the effort in, what it's taken to grow all of that, and you're not just going to like take it or give it away irresponsibly. Like, very probably you're going to be like, I grew this myself and it took me 2 months, and like, I had to spray them every day with water. Yeah. You're not just going to kind of dropping a tab here or a tab there. And that's really about developing appropriate like reverence for the substance, and on the basis being the basis of sacred experience, potentially transformational experience. So my sense is that anyone who has the dedication to grow and the patience to grow mushrooms over the course of a couple of months, very probably has the patience to be with whatever comes up, because as we've explored and spoken about, like, it isn't always pleasurable, it isn't always pretty. There may well be difficult things that come up there, and for the duration of these 2 months that the mushrooms are growing, even better if you start cultivating a regular meditation practice. Right. If you've been meditating every day for 2 months, and whilst these mushrooms have been growing, I then think you're in a pretty good place to have what might be like a first psychedelic experience. And very, very probably you'd want to do that in the company of a friend, either taking if it is a first time, either taking like a lower dose or even no dose at all, just to make sure that like everything's smooth. Equally, many people do have their first psychedelic experiences in groups where everyone is taking the same dose, so like a potentially higher dose, and mostly that's great as well. But just think about it. And we should also add the disclaimer that like there are certain mental health conditions where it is very important to at minimum do like really serious research into whether taking psychedelics are a good idea. You can find more about that on our website. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are not toys. They are
they're extremely powerful substances that have the capacity to significantly alter, perception and one's sense of self, and in an ongoing way, as indeed we've explored. So it's really important to be careful and to be patient. And I wish that, there's many occasions in which I had been more careful and more patient in relation to my use of psychedelic substances. So in that sense, don't make the same mistakes I did. I've given you my advice there, like grow your own and meditate whilst you're doing it.
Yeah, I know you to be fearless in your decision making and move forward and be spontaneous. So I think that carries a little bit more weight.
But do take them. That's, maybe I should add that part as well. Like be careful, but do take it. Yeah.
Take your time, but do take it.